It's interesting because, first of all, like you were saying, you had seen this podcast around and I had talked to some friends, which is nice to hear. But it's interesting to me because, I do research before I talk to people and I look at, what other interviews have they done? I listen to the music, all that sort of thing. And it seemed like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like you don't do a ton of these, like a ton of interviews in general.
I do and I don't. Okay, so I guess I would like to do more interviews because I actually really like doing interviews. I think that one of the reasons why it may appear so is that we haven't really had a lot of things to push over the last few years, especially post-pandemic. And we turned down a lot of things until the time is right. I think even you reached out like maybe a year or 2 years ago. And I remember I was telling my team, I was like, I'd like to do this, but I'd like to do this at the right time. But I do feel like years ago, it's crazy doing this for so long. I feel like maybe from 2015 to 2017, I was doing a lot of interviews and then it kind of like slowed down a little bit. But the nature of things just changed a little bit and we just wanted to wait for the right time. So as we're rolling stuff out this year, we're just dipping our feet in and trying to do, more interviews.
Well, sure. Yeah. And I mean, that all makes sense. I just think it's interesting in today's climate of it's hard to say no to things, I think, as an artist in 2023. Like, I think there's a pressure that you're supposed to be always out there and always on. And I mean, even, I think we could extend this to even your release schedule, which has been, in comparison to like the bigger EDM or whatever you want to call it world, I think, it's a conservative release schedule. You're not dropping a single every single month of your life, that kind of thing. And all of that, I think, and this is actually one of the things I wrote down, I wanted to ask you about. Like, I think with what you've done, and you established it very early on when you started this project, there's been sort of a scarcity to it. Mm-hmm. And there's been a little bit, I don't know if mystery is too strong a word, but there's been, it's not all out there. It's not all public all the time. And I wanted to ask you kind of if that was intentional, how you deal with sort of the push-pull of, the public and the private, keeping something for yourself, and also maintaining that kind of energy around what you do.
Oh, that's a great question. You might be probably one of the first people to make note of the scarcity. And obviously that's something that, after years of being on the scene, the picture becomes clear that like, yes, I am quite scarce in my releases. But it's funny because that is something that we are actively changing this year and for this upcoming era. But we can start with talking about why that was for a really long time. I've been I talk to my friends about this. I talk about changing landscapes. I talk about entry points into the music industry, where, for me, I come from the SoundCloud hype machine era. And today what we're living in is the TikTok era, right? And these kind of systems are ever changing and, the doors open, doors close, and you kind of have to roll with it as you go along, right? And at the time of me entering the scene, things happened very quickly for me. I think I got really lucky. I talked to a lot of people about this, about how it almost felt like a fluke. Like with Indian Summer, I had been in contact with Odessa. I did a remix for them and they were super friendly when I first played Seattle for the first time ever at Numos. Sorry, not Numos, Q nightclub in 2015.
Yeah. Shout out to Q. That's a great club.
Great. Yeah. Super fun club. That was the first time I ever played Seattle. I met Harrison from Odessa. They had, to put into perspective of what they were doing, they were doing the In Return tour. They just played Gobi at Coachella. And we went out for drinks and he said, we were starting a record label. We're starting Foreign Family. We'd love to have you submit something. And I submitted Indian Summer as like a beat. It was just like a beat concept. I thought it was bad. In all of the interviews I did in 2015, 2016, I was like, you check me on this. I said, this is my worst song ever or whatever to my management.
Well, and
And
let me not to cut you off there, but I think that is the case. You share that with a lot of artists, where all of a sudden the hit is the one that's you're like, what, that one? Like this is
yeah,
this dumb idea, and then that becomes
yeah,
the hit, sort of
yeah,
unexpectedly in a lot of cases, which can create its own blessings and curses in a way.
totally. And that's sort of, relates back to the scarcity thing. What had happened, long story short, is that the song had exploded across 2 or 3 years. And it was funny because I think the peak daily plays wasn't until 2017 or 2018, which meant that it was on a steady incline for 3 years straight. And I compare that to how things work now with TikTok, because what had happened to me in the span of about 3 or 4 years can sometimes happen now to a song in just a year. And it's terrifying. Yeah, so basically what happened was, because I was kind of thrust into touring and putting on shows, that really put a strain on what I wanted to do musically, because I was riding off the energy of this one song. Suddenly I was playing these rooms that I didn't really feel like I was supposed to be playing at that time, looking back. And that really put me in a tough position in terms of writing, because I just truly didn't really know what to do. So it took about 4 years for me to develop that first record in 2019. But I feel like then become known as someone who would release like one song a year. I had one song in 2015, kind of an EP in 2016, Starlight in 2017, Lost in 2018, and then an album in 2019, and then one song in 2020, one song in 22, and then now we're finally rolling out again. But it really takes time. It really took me a long time to really figure out what I wanted to do. And a lot of stuff that I was making after Indian Summer didn't sound like Indian Summer. And I was still kind of finding myself musically. But yeah, the scarcity thing is really interesting, because that does not work anymore. That is something that I kind of got away with from 2015 to 2019. The bookings were fine. All that stuff, like, it worked out. You cannot do that today. Like there's not an artist that I think could have something similar happen like that. It's really a place for, it's an attention economy. You have to be constantly releasing at least one a month if you're brand new, if you want to get momentum and leverage into doing your own headline tours and all that stuff,
Well, how do you feel about that? Is that, getting more active and being out there? Like, obviously, any creative person on a long enough timeline, you have to adapt to different mediums and styles and all that to stay relevant, stay in the game. But you personally, how does that feel to kind of make that switch into, really jumping back in the stream?
It feels good, to be honest. My opinions are ever changing. I used to be quite precious about the art, and I used to be very precious about, like, oh, it needs to be in like a project or an album. And that's why I was very hesitant to release like one-off singles. I really never liked the concept of a one-off single, which is what we live in today, where like a lot of things are just kind of like one-off. They're not really a part of any project. It's just like, hey, I made a song, here it is. And I used to be so anti that, because I loved albums. I listened to bands. I listened to hip hop. I liked the idea of an album, and then a gap, and then 3 years, 4 years go by, and then another album, because that sort of built anticipation and excitement in your favorite bands. Like, these days, you don't have that same excitement for like getting a CD or anything like that. It's sort of this quick hit of like, here's a song, it's on streaming services, and then you're quickly served very, soon after. And for a long time, perhaps it was due to insecurity or something, I felt like I almost looked down on that kind of release style, when in actuality, I had quite a hard time. If I could be candid, I had a hard time coming up with musical ideas and musical concepts. And so I'd always chalk it up to like, oh, well, I just want to make it a full thing. But now I feel way more confident as like a songwriter and a producer, and I feel less precious about like, oh, I need to like wait until like this is a fully formed project or whatever. And it's just more fun to feed listeners at the end of the day without expecting something to blow up or whatever. Especially because if you wait too long, your personal attachment to the song starts to wane a little bit, especially if it's like a song you wrote like 2 years ago. and it's
That's a
getting
great
released
point.
now. Yeah, and I know a lot of people get tired and sick of their thing that they have to promote if they wrote it like 2 years ago. I mean, my last single that just came out, Paris, came out last month, was the quickest time from writing to release out of anything I ever made. I had written that in December of last year, and we just felt like, oh, it's something that we can kind of put out and not worry too much about it was a nice padding for some of the bigger singles that are about to come out. But yeah, it's fun. It's more fun now. Like, I think before it used to feel like labor. Like, sometimes as your hobby transitions into work and your career, like it feels like work. And I struggled with that for a really long time. And I think over the last few years, I reinvigorated my love for it. And it's now like, why hold the fans hostage, or why hold the songs hostage? Like, let's get them out. Let's get them out to the world.
Sure, yeah, and I think there's a certain freedom, at least that's what I'm hearing from you saying this, to kind of getting back to the more bare bones, like you were talking about the SoundCloud era and all that. And I mean, that's what SoundCloud was. You know, there would be producers who would make a song and throw it up on the website the same day, and some people made careers off of that, you know, and there would be accounts that would be posting 10 songs in a week, you know, and for months on months. Like, it was kind of Wild West. Oh yeah. Shout out to Carmack. He was the king of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And yeah, that Wild West mentality, I think that's actually a really positive way to look at this sort of attention economy that we're in, is that rather than seeing it as something that's like leeching your energy that you constantly have to be feeding, it's more about, I think what you said is adjust your perception of yourself maybe, and your work. And, you know, just if you're having fun making something, now's the time to share it. You know, like, people are more open to hearing more stuff than maybe they were before.
Totally. There's that. And there's also just livelihood at the end of the day. Like, I still want to do music. I'm also in my 30s now. So the way I approach what I do is different from when I was in my 20s. I think when Indian Summer had come out, I was 24, and I'm 30. I'm 31 now, and my approach to everything is different because there's just a bit more seriousness in what I'd like to do and where I'd like to be, and a lot of that means having the music come out at the end of the day, and being on top of things. And it's also just like a very competitive landscape. It's become more competitive now than it was 5, 6, 7 years ago, because not only are you kind of just making sure that you can release your own music and go on tour and stuff, but you're also kind of, you know, there's like a whole new generation of artists that are like coming on the scene. So another part of it is like, if you're not releasing music, well, the attention is just going to be shifted to this whole new, you know, the shiny new toys that are kind of like popping up, which is, you know, that's natural. It's always been like that. But like, yeah, you just can't be precious about the music anymore. You know, you can't gatekeep yourself.
That's a really good way to put it. Yeah. And I think that maybe is a good way to talk about sort of where you're at now with, you know, you've got an upcoming tour, and you mentioned, you know, lots more releases on the way. Is it, yeah, I mean, I guess we sort of touched on this, but just to drive it home, like, is jumping back in that way? I'll give you an example, actually. So like, I do this podcast every week, right? And I've done it for over 5 years now. And it's just, you know, it's become sort of part of the fabric of my day-to-day reality. And then just recently, like, I took like 3 weeks off from recording any and doing any interviews. And you're actually the first person I'm sitting back down with. And like, 3 weeks is not that long of a time, right? But I swear to you, when I sat down and started setting this up, in my brain, I was like, I can't do that. I've forgotten how to do this. None of this feels familiar. I don't feel capable of doing this thing that obviously I know how to do and have done for a long time. Do you get that? And with touring or with music or with any of that kind of thing, when you're sort of gearing up to get back into something like this?
Yes. And this is also why there was I can break down my scarcity eras into two eras. The first era was like Indian Summer to album, and then the second era is the pandemic. But with the pandemic, there was a lot of like we could see the horizon far away, and we talked about 2023, 2022 back in 2020. Like, how are we rebuilding? This is something that me and my friends talk about. I use this word a lot. How are we all sort of rebuilding our personal journeys and our personal paths? So this is something you get better at as you get older, and that's anticipating. That's anticipating what is ahead. I knew that I had this tour, which actually, if I'm going to be pretty candid on this podcast, was supposed to be booked for the spring, I think, or maybe last year. I can't remember, but we kind of shifted things.
Sure.
Things are always in flux, but we knew that it was going to be like 22, 23. That meant making sure there's obviously music to be put out. And, that meant being in sessions. I was doing sessions. I wasn't really doing sessions in 2020. That was like a very tough year for everybody. I found myself to be completely uninspired. I had just come off my 2019 run with the first record, and 2020 was meant to be a massive festival year. We were supposed to do Coachella that year. So having everything canceled, Red Rocks, like having everything canceled was tough. And I really just sat around and played video games all day.
I think a lot of us did. You're not alone there.
Yeah. And like when 2021 rolled around with the vaccinations and everything, it felt like it was like go, 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 go. And off the bat, the first thing we had was I had two support tours. I did direct support for Lewis and Child, and then I did direct support for Porter Robinson. So immediately I was like on the road in the fall. That also meant that it was really hard to do sessions and get music written. I was demoing a lot that year in 2021, where I had a lot of instrumental ideas and a couple of sessions here and there, but it wasn't just like a year's worth of writing. And then 2022 rolled around last year. Last year was like constant writing from January to the end of the year. And we were fleshing out ideas, finishing ideas, feeling super inspired. And then now we're in 2023, and now we're at like the rollout phase of everything, where we have the singles coming out and we have our tour set for the fall. A lot of that is getting mentally prepared for that. I think with touring, like getting ready with those direct support tours and getting to do Red Rocks last year and getting to do Coachella this year, this is stuff that has been on the books for 3 years. And once you've gone through the gauntlet, and you go through the gauntlet over and over again, you do your best to remember the mistakes you made before and try to not make the same mistakes again.
Yeah.
But for me, it's a lot of mental preparation at the end of the day. I try to keep my head on straight as much as possible. This morning, like I box now. I've been boxing for the last 2 years. I went on a hike. Now I'm like doing 2-hour workouts at least once a week. I exercise frequently. I'm sober. I don't drink alcohol. I haven't drank in like 3.5 years. All this stuff was in preparation for doing something like Coachella this year and doing like massive 10-week tour in the fall.
Well, that's interesting. Just doing the math a little bit. Did you get sober right around when the pandemic started?
Yeah. So actually, we were booked for Coachella 2020, summer of 19. So I had finished my album run, and then our offer came in about July of 19 for the 2020 festival date. And I got the offer in July, and then in August I started sobriety because I wanted to make sure that the Coachella show was like really good. And I had seen this interview with John Mayer on Complex, and he talked about how he was sober, and I found that quite inspiring for someone to be in their 40s who's doing his John Mayer thing, his Dead and Company, doing arena tours. I thought that was really impressive, and he said something about how being sober opened up being able to work on the weekends. And there might be a lot of arguments against like overworking yourself and being a slave to your own cause or whatnot, but I found that what I wanted to do. I really wanted it pretty badly. So I had to eliminate something in my life to make room for the clear headspace to put on a show like Coachella. I mean, thankfully we did have an extra 3 years to prepare, but like, yeah. I'm glad that I had started that in 2019 because, you know, coming into 2023, almost 4 years later, it just, you know, it enabled me to be super focused in on what I truly wanted to do.
Was that your, sorry, I don't know this. Was that your first Coachella?
It was my second, actually. So the first one was third if you count Doolab, but just depends on how you count it. But Doolab was the first time in 15. 17, we did Gobi. My agent wanted to start me out on a smaller tent, and then meant to do Sahara for years. Like, you know, it was funny seeing like everyone around me getting like their Sahara moment. But it's funny, like doing Sahara this year, it was meant to be. I was a little scared about having such a big gap narratively, 6 years between Coachella performances, but it was meant to be this year. I think that's a testament to being patient, you know?
Well, yeah. And to take it back to that scarcity thing again, I think, you know, it really can work in your favor, even though obviously that gap wasn't intentional. But, you know, I think also Coachella really thrives off that kind of thing of like, this person hasn't popped up in a
coming back.
Yeah, all that kind of thing. But, you know, all that is to say, like, as you're talking about all of this, man, I mean, you seem and you sound very focused, like very, very focused on this project and what you're doing and all the ideas you have for it and all the different things you're adjusting and tweaking in your life to maximize this project. Have you always been like this? Like, where does this sort of this crazy ability to focus and motivate and not get distracted and, you know, commit and all of that, like, where does that come from?
I mean, like, you know, the music industry, you know how intense it is. And like, everyone kind of has like a party phase. Everyone gets distracted super easily. I've seen all sides of it. I've experienced what it's like to be on a tour and just party. It's fun. But at some point, like, when it starts to affect your work or starts to affect your career, like I've seen, didn't necessarily happen to me, but I've seen it happen to different people who start to prioritize that over the music or whatnot, or the lifestyle over the music. And for me, I just wanted to do this as long as I can. I want to do it as long as I can. And I want to make something that I'm super proud of. And a lot of that does require a lot of focus and attention. And sometimes, like, you know, none of this happens naturally. I think that, you know, when you're a fan and when you see something great, it always does appear effortless, of course. But behind the scenes is a lot of hard work being done by a lot of different people. That also, like, some of the things that I've experienced over the last few years in terms of like wanting something and actually actualizing it. A lot of that is going to sound really corny and cliche and whatnot, but it's really got to come from yourself at the end of the day. I think there have been times where I really wanted something and it didn't really work out. And it's not that I didn't want it enough, but sometimes that can come down to communication or verbalizing it or making decks or slides or whatnot. Like, this sounds really silly, but like,
no, I know what you mean. I know what you mean. Yeah. There is, for all of the sort of big dreams that we sell in America and in the entertainment industry, you know, if you break it down, if the big dream is at the top of the pyramid, you go all the way down to the bottom, it's a spreadsheet, you know?
Totally. But like, let me like try to explain this a bit more. Like, my manager is amazing. I love him so much. He rarely drops the ball. He's great. But in the past, what I've noticed is like, if I say something and it doesn't really get past the finish line or isn't like fully executed, I have like an honest conversation with him, and we'll kind of look back and assess and be like, oh, why didn't this happen? And sometimes a lot of that can be traced to me not stating it more or stating it clearly or something. It's usually me at the end of the day. And unless you have like a really strong team that includes like a creative director and people who are like on payroll and all this stuff, where you have like major label budgets or whatnot, like you can't really expect the work to be done without you at the helm driving the ship. And that's something that I've realized over the last 3 or 4 years, through trial and error, through making things happen and also things that didn't quite happen. It's me at the end of the day, captain of the ship. So if something doesn't happen, I have to take responsibility for that. And that's something that I've learned. I'm never one to point fingers or blame or anything like that. Sometimes that is the case where it's not my fault and it's someone else's fault. But in terms of like idea to actualization to execution, blah, 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 it really comes down to me. So a lot of this hyper-focused stuff, the stuff about like being sober or working out, like a lot of that is kind of tied to my work in music, where I just want to be on top of everything and make sure everything comes to life. And the reason why I say the major label thing is because I am an independent artist. I'm signed to an independent label. They're great to work with. I do enjoy working with them. But sometimes, like, if I want to see something happen, I'm just going to have to be on top of it at the end of the day. They're balancing working with a dozen other artists. Maybe one of those artists are having like a TikTok moment or something. So they'll put more time and energy into that. So you're really, it has to come from yourself at the end of the day. No one's going to do it for you.
Oh, dude, 100%. And this is interesting because I don't always go this deeply into process and sort of the making it happen side of things. But I'm curious because we're talking about it for you, like with that understanding that at the end of the day, it all comes from you. How do you divide up your days and your weeks? Are you trying to do like a little bit of everything every day, put out some fires, keep all the balls in the air? Or is it more in phases where it's like, today I'm just in the studio, I'm not answering emails? How does that play out for you?
Sure. I mean, that's a really good question. So what we do is kind of like, I guess, reverse scheduling. So like, for example, because we've done this so many times, like our tour is starting at the top of August and Coachella was in April, which means that we had 3 months between Coachella and the tour. We had May, June, and July. May was like a bit of a vacation month for me. I got to go home back to New York for a month to see my friends and family. We had one song to release, so I kind of had to stay on top of that. And then I knew I was going to come back to LA for June, July. Now what we're doing is we're basically rotating between some music days where I'm writing new music, and then days where I'm focused on building out the show. I have calls set up with our visual team to do visuals and stuff. I have merch concepts and stuff, and like, I have my days basically pretty scheduled out for me, but also at the end of the day, like I try to be on top of my own scheduling where if I know I need to do something, I'm just going to do it. So that I'm prepared for it. Like even last week, like on Friday, Saturday, I was like, all right, well, let me like make super specific like decks for merch and some visualizer treatments and visual stuff. It's just, again, it's like at this level, it's like, I have to be doing something. If it's not music, I have to do admin stuff or I have to do creative stuff. This is largely because we don't have a creative director. We've talked about it for years. It's so expensive. It's not quite where I'm at. So a lot of it, again, has to come from myself. But it's fun, man. Again, I try to make it as fun and collaborative as possible. The people that I work with are great people. And it's really about making it not feel like work at the end of the day.
I mean, that's the dream, man. I mean, that's the only way I think to sort of sustain a career in this business is constantly tricking yourself to make you think that you're not doing a lot of work, you know?
Totally. Yeah.
Let me ask you, so we've talked a lot about sort of where your head is at right now and what you're working on. I want to go into a little more detail about sort of where you're headed musically and all that in a minute. But before we get there, let me take it back and ask, you mentioned we were talking at the beginning of this when Indian Summer came out and when this project was sort of introduced to the world. Maybe it blew up before you were even ready for it to blow up. Who was that kid? Who was that version of you at that age before you sort of learned all these lessons and figured out how to really organize this in a way that works for you?
I don't know. Who was I? I mean, I was just I felt very lost for a really long time because I think in that era of the early 2010s, music was still kind of like a pipe dream. It felt like this impossible thing that, like, if you didn't know the right people, if you weren't signed to a label, like, you weren't going to make it. And then suddenly things like SoundCloud and Hype Machine were happening where it felt like there was like an in, right?
And were you at that time, was music the thing? You were going for it?
Kind of. I had just finished college and I thought I'd maybe work at a label or become a manager or an A&R person or something. I really wasn't sure. I felt like I had fucked up almost, especially because in my community, I'm from Bangladesh and my family, they're quite supportive now, but like a lot of the stereotypes of our community are quite true. The kids become doctors and hyper successful, they're making six figures, all that stuff. So the kind of thing that happened after college where I moved back to my parents, I felt like quite a failure at that point in 2013 it was.
Yeah.
But that was also around the same time where I told my parents, like, let me give this music thing a shot. Let me do it for a year or two. Let me live in your basement and like make beats, whatever. They were super, super supportive about that. But I was just some kid. I was really down on myself. I kind of had a chip on my shoulder. I was doing some local DJ stuff in New York. And I want to say I didn't have like quote unquote a hustler mentality or anything like that. I don't think I even had the work ethic back then. I think I just chanced upon the entry point looking back, like very honestly speaking, because I've met truly talented kids who are working their ass off and networking, blah, blah, blah. And kids who deservedly, they should have like big careers and all that. And I've seen people work from there to having it. I know like someone like Millennium is like that. I know Griffin is like that. I want to say that their work ethics were much more in place earlier in their careers. They're very hardworking and very talented people. I think I had chanced upon this entry point and I just didn't know what was like ahead for me. I didn't expect the song to like be in commercials and TV shows and movies, and it was just everywhere. And I just wasn't ready for that, to be honest.
Well, sure. It's hard to imagine who would be, really. Were you part of any community locally as far as music goes? Because, New York, like DJ scene, clubbing, like late 2000s, early 2010s, there's a lot of cool shit going on there.
There was, but there wasn't like an upward circuit. Like I feel like LA had things like Brownies and Lemonade and Insomniac events where like a lot of kids start here and then they move on their way to things like EDC or Hard Summer. But in New York, the club circuit was like insular and closed off and wasn't being incubated higher than that. My scene was just online. It was my friends. It was Moving Castle. It was Manila Killa, Hotel Garuda, AO Beats, all those guys. And we were just all friends and we all came from the East Coast. Chris was from DC and AO was from Boston. So they'd come to New York and do a show. We'd all get together. We'd all get together in DC. We'd all get together in Boston. And that sort of incubated us online. And then suddenly we were getting booked on the West Coast. And then we all kind of like started to move over here.
So how did you learn how to DJ or perform in the first place?
Man, that's a really good question. I I came from the band world kind of, and I got into producing because I couldn't find bandmates. I had to learn how to make all the stuff myself. And uh, I was really into things like Fall Out Boy and Cobra Starship. And I came from that world. But I really like things like Cobra Starship and Owl City because they were doing like synth pop, indie pop type stuff. And DJing started to happen because I didn't really get EDM at first. I really like Skrillex and I like Madeon, pop culture, like going viral on YouTube. So some of my first DJ stuff was through an APC 40 because that was the thing that like Madeon had like a launch pad and a lot of mashup artists were using APC 40. So I was using that for a really long time. And then it was just not it was very frustrating to bring to clubs. And then the next thing was Tractor because Chris Manilkill was on Tractor. And I was like, all right, this seems like a good starting point. And then it was like, all right, I will have to learn CDJs because bringing Tractor in a suitcase is like no fun. It's actually crazy to think that I was using Tractor for however long, but I started, APC 40, then Tractor, then CDJs. And then that's kind of how I got into it. And I've talked to a lot of people about this in interviews back then where I didn't come from a place where I was looking at Swedish House Mafia or any of these DJs thinking like, it wasn't aspirational for me. The way I explained it to a lot of people is I almost fell into it. But then when I saw like Porter Robinson, when I saw Odessa, that's kind of when it clicked of like, oh, there's a way to do electronic music, but do it live and not necessarily use decks. And so over the course of like 5 years, it wasn't until 2019 when I had sort of like figured out what the live show was. It took a really long time. And even now we're still like tinkering with it and refining it. Like we had just debuted a brand new iteration of it at Coachella this year. That's been like a 10-year long journey. Like the fact that I saw Worlds at Terminal 5 in New York City in 2014 being like, oh, this like live electronic music, it's possible. It's entirely possible. That's been a long journey, but yeah, it's so many different forms of performing, you know?
No, of course. And I just had a mini realization while you were talking that I'm surprised I haven't actually thought that much about before, that you're right that, I mean, now there is almost two different classes or genres, that sort of live indie electronic music versus the more whatever EDM DJ centric thing. But they're all, it's funny because unless you get to sort of a big headliner status, they're all presented kind of on the same stage and it's sort of consumed in a similar way. You know, it's just sort of a one long festival lineup kind of thing. And it's interesting. Yeah. I wonder if we'll see more and more of kind of that delineation of the two, because I think there's appreciation from both sides for the other, but it is kind of maybe coming from a different place or with different intentions, or maybe just more effective when presented in different ways. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's funny because I've talked to fans about this, and sometimes they don't even know what the difference is.
Yeah, true. So, that's fair. True. Yeah, maybe I'm just up my own ass with this, but
no. I agree with what you're saying. There's definitely I like how we have two different things to present. I like how we have our live show and we have a DJ set because that makes it fun for me that I get to do two different types of expressions, right? But it's funny because live just means so many different things. There's like Odessa where it's like, all right, they got the drums and the horns and everything. And then there's like someone like G Jones, where it's a bit more like Ableton, but he's not really like spinning on decks, right? Like those are both live, but they're two different things. And then there's also the thing of like, when you're on CDJs, you're still playing live. It's all this like terminology thing that gets confusing with fans because they like in their heads they're like, yeah, Odessa, they're DJing, but they're not really DJing. But you know, at the end of the day, it doesn't. You know, for me, like the live show, if for any fans who are watching this, the live show is like 100% just my music. It's like my music presented in long form sequences. You get the time coded visuals, a light show, and like basically just my music presented live. And then DJing for me is largely curation, where it's like, all right, I'll slip in a couple of my tracks, but I also really want to play this Chris Lake song or maybe this San Holo song or something. And that to me is really fun because I can just play whatever I want and not think too hard about it. And it's nice to have those two things to present. So if we get booked for festivals or whatnot, we can kind of decide, oh, this is like an EDM festival. Let's do like a DJ set. Oh, this is like mixed genre festival like Coachella. Let's do our live show, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the intentions of the artist too. Like there's, certain DJs, you see them on stage and you can tell it's like, oh, they're sort of picturing themselves as like like the singer of a metal band kind of thing. And then you see somebody else. Maybe you look at what you do and maybe when you think of yourself, it's more like, I don't know, like an Owl City kind of thing, or more of an indie mindset where it's like, yes, we're presenting this in a large sort of epic way, but sort of the emotion of it is intimate, or is thoughtful, or is, any of those words. I mean, it makes me want to ask you too, sort of as you've grown as an artist, as the project has gotten bigger, I think you've always been very good as a songwriter in terms of kind of what I was just saying, making a song feel sort of intimate and indie and kind of, stripped down, but then still sonically being very big and very explosive and something that works, in an arena or in front of 1,000 people, that kind of thing. And I think that sort of indie mindset it's an old idea, but it's hard to do well. And I don't know, this is sort of a general question, but is that something you think about? Is that something you've sort of learned anything about over the years of like how to keep it feeling personal while it's getting bigger?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. That's definitely something I thought about for a really long time, and even definitely affected some of my sonic choices. What's great is that sometimes you can, reconfigure songs to sound a little bit bigger live. So something that I've been doing for the last few years is like if I have like a live version of a song, sometimes I'll switch the drums out to make it feel a bit more anthemic. So actually, the version of Indian Summer that I played live, I switched the drums out in 2019 so they feel like a drum set, so they feel bigger, because the original kit that I used kind of were like, it's like a tinier kit and kind of, made sense because I made it in my parents' basement. Like the environment that I made it in felt small at the time, but then the song became so big, so I felt like I had to present it in like a bigger way. So I swapped out the drums for larger anthemic drums. There's like a longer intro and a longer outro and all that. And I do that for a lot of the records when I work on them live, where it's like, how can I reconfigure the settings where it's like, yeah, you still get the intimate feeling of the lyrics and all the synth elements and everything, but everything kind of hits harder live. That's always fun to do. I'm a big fan of reconfiguring your discography in the live show. It's that to me, a lot of joy comes from that for sure.
Yeah, that's a really good point too, I think, for any producers who might be listening, is that it can be a very small choice or a small change that can totally alter the feel of what you're working on or the way somebody receives it. And that, if something's not working, on the flip side, that again, it could be a tiny change. It's like sometimes like when you have that idea for a song or for a live presentation or any of that, if it's a good idea, it can be frustrating when it doesn't work right away, but it's, I think there's something to that sometimes it's just a little tweak, just, change the kick drum, or whatever the equivalent of changing the kick drum is for that idea. Sometimes that's all it takes to like totally change the feel of it.
Yeah. It's funny because like, I know VIP drops are really popular to do for live exclusivity. So if you don't know, VIP in live setting stands for variance in production. And it's usually when someone tweaks a song so it feels a bit more active live. Like usually VIPs don't end up on streaming services unless they release them like a year later or whatever. Yeah. But I definitely have some songs where I like add VIP moments and stuff like that. But sometimes to me, some of my favorite variants in productions is things like that. Like you said, like just swapping out the drum kit or creating like a longer intro or longer outro. Because a song like Indian Summer doesn't need like a heavy bass drop VIP section. You know, it just, like you said, like, yeah, just a little tweak to make it feel like, oh, this makes sense in like a larger space or whatever. And that's been something that I've been figuring out with some of the newer songs that I'm writing, because some of them are like Want It All is an interesting song, because I'd never written a song like Want It All before. It feels quite intimate and quite small. It's like piano with like some garagey drums and like a vocal chop. Like it feels like a small song. Yeah. And so that was something that when we brought it to Coachella for the first time, I was like, all right, like this is a situation where I feel like maybe I'll play half the song the way you get it in streaming services. And then the back half, I'll have like a really fun jump up and down moment. Like, you know, it's the Sahara tent. I should have like a moment where there is like an instrumental drop. And that's fun to do too, where it's like I get to still present the song kind of in its original form, but then I also have this like really fun high energy moment to just get people on their feet, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at this point with the new songs, and like I was listening to I Dread the Day He Takes You to Paris also today, which also felt like a new, like it sounded like you, but it felt like a different aspect, a side of you I hadn't heard before. Do you feel like you are heading in a direction? Like, is this kind of territory something you've been trying to steer towards? Or is this more related to what you were talking about earlier of not being as precious, and that kind of you've always had a lot of these ideas and now you're just letting more of them out?
That's a really good question. I think the latter a little bit. I think for me, there's no like definitive sound or place that I'm trying to go. For me, writing music and continuing what I want to do as Jai Wolf is always one foot in the future and one foot in the past. I think that keeping familiar sonic palettes is really important to me, where you can kind of tell that it's still me at the end of the day, but I still want to try new territory and not be confined in the same world. And I think one of the things I really pride myself on is if you took a listen to my discography, there's not a lot of things that feel like there are two of. I don't think I have a second Indian Summer. I don't think I have Lose My Mind, but I don't really have any other songs that sound like this. The closest might be Your Way and other stuff on TCPL, but there's no like upbeat guitar riff sounding song. I don't really have like another Moonrider. And right now, like with Want It All and with Paris, they kind of stand on their own. And that's been a fun little challenge. I think with Want It All, there are still some like synthy moments that touch upon the Jai Wolf sound. I still think the vocal chop is like extremely me. And when we were making Paris, it was like, okay, we're doing like this up tempo. It's like 152 BPM. It has like a D&B feel, but I wouldn't really call it D&B. And when I was making that with the drum kits, I was like, well, if this is going to come out right after Want It All, I was like, I think it should have the Want It All kit. So what I did was I actually took the kick and snare from Want It All and I applied it to Paris, because it was originally a bit harder hitting. It was like almost like kind of like Moonrider's drums. But then I switched it to Want It All because I was like, oh, well, it's like, this is our single 1, single 2. So that's been fun to do. That's been fun to just like push a little bit into new territory where it's like, all right, I've never really written a garagey song before. I've never really written like a D&B song. They're both pop at the end of the day. Want It All is still a pop song. Paris is still a pop song, but they're not using the expected tropes. And I think that one of the things that I really wanted to do with this new era is present a certain level of unexpectedness, not like complete reinvention or new territory to the point of alienation, because I personally don't think I could. Some artists are really good at that, where you can like take a huge risk, but you're also risking alienating part of your fan base. I still wanted to keep my, as many fans as possible. But yeah, I think one foot in the future and one foot in the past is kind of how I explain it,
That makes total sense. And that's so smart in terms of following up a single, not by sort of trying to recreate the same single that people liked, but by just incorporating some of the bones of it, the DNA of it into. That's a very smart thing to do. And I think another thing, like you said, you wanted to sort of give people something unexpected or be unpredictable in a way at this point. And one thing for me that accomplishes that in what you do is it's always an interesting mix of elements. And so to use something like Paris as an example, you were saying it's sort of influenced by like drum and bass rhythms, but it's a little slower and it has different drums, right, that are a little more indie, a little more rock, something like that. And so already, it's sort of an interesting mix of things. And then on top of that, another thing I had written down is I think a through line throughout a lot of your music is these sort of dreamy, cinematic, like sound washes, these soundscapes that you make. A lot of it reminded me of like sort of 80s pop music in a lot of ways. Do you have strong influences either from like 80s pop or maybe soundtracks or cinema stuff from that time? Because a lot of it really, to me, harkens back to sort of what was happening then.
Yeah. It's funny because I love that stuff for sure. I try to lean into it without going full blown. I think the closest song that is maybe like a full synth pop, synth wave song is maybe something like Still Sleeping off my last record. But for me, I'm a child of the 90s. I was born in 91. So one of the reasons why 80s stuff kind of I'm drawn towards is because, like, I guess I would be in a department store or I would be at the grocery store and they would be playing 80s music in the 90s, right? So I think for me, it's an interesting case of like, these are the things that were sort of it's stuck in the back of my mind, but I wasn't actively listening to it. I couldn't really name you a lot of music from that time. There are definitely a couple things here and there that I have later in life figured out was the blueprint. I mean, you have things like Blue Monday by New Order or Tina Turner, The Best, which I know is a really random song and I know she just died, but like that song to me is like a hit, and
oh yeah,
maybe like 10 years ago, I couldn't probably name you that song, but that song was still like, I would hear it and I'd be like, oh, I really like that one synth melody. I really like this chord progression. It's like hitting my heart in a way. So a lot of that has to do with, as you said, like the DNA, like the DNA of the 80s definitely is something I'm drawn towards. And it's funny because I'm seeing this phenomenon happen with younger kids with things like hyperpop, because these hyperpop kids are borrowing riffs from like pop punk and Blink 182 and Fall Out Boy. And it's funny because I'm like, they've definitely probably never listened to them. They probably never really listened to like 303. Like I used to be a really big 303 fan. And it's so funny how a lot of the hyperpop feels like 303. It's like they were doing distorted synths and like pop punk melody riffs and combining rapping and singing and like break-ins. Like I'm listening to break-ins and I'm like, this is just like more emotional 303 at the end of the day. But it's the same thing. These kids who are now teenagers or young 20s, like they were too young to remember that time, but that music was playing for them while their parents took them to the grocery store, the department store. And it's very, very fascinating to see them have the same effect because I can pinpoint the references, but I don't think they could,
Yeah. Oh man, I could talk about this all day. And it's the same for all of us too, right? I mean, I talk a lot on this show, probably too much about sort of my early influences and how, for me, all I want to do when I'm DJing, when I'm writing music, whatever it is I'm just trying to make myself feel like that music made me feel at that time, And so it's less about what the actual music was and more kind of this thing we keep coming back to, the DNA of like, well, what were they doing that made me feel like that? And, because you can never go back, like just playing the same song again. It's nostalgia, but it's not that sort of jolt, the first time you hear it kind of thing. And
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's a
That's
weird alchemy, but I love
yeah.
talking about it.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's like I wanna harness that feeling and that energy for sure, and but try to be as tasteful with it as possible, but also at the same time try not to overthink it. I
Right.
think that's the balance at the end of the day. Like these days, everything I've made in the last few years, um, going back to not being super precious about your art or anything, or being gatekeeping yourself. For me now, it's like, all right, if I really like something, I can't overthink how people are going to perceive me or judge me or whatever. If I like it, I like it. That's kind of it at the end of the day, and you just move on. I think overthinking that and thinking too hard about like where it will land in people's perception, especially on this like very subjective quote unquote cool scale of like what is cool and what's uncool. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter at the end of the day, and I think that's something that maybe I was very in my mind about in the late 2010s, and now I just simply do not care.
I mean, that's the way to be, man. That's absolutely right. Is yeah, the more you overthink it, the bigger risk you take of sort of ruining the whole thing, you know?
That, and it's an age thing too. Like I have nothing to prove anymore. I talk to my friends about this. It's like I know I used the word competitive before, and I meant that in an objective sense, in that the landscape is competitive. 5, 6 years ago, on top of the landscape feeling competitive back then, I too felt competitive. I felt like I was competing with my contemporaries for opportunities. I would see so and so get this op, and then I'd think, why can't I do that? Right
Yeah.
now, I've tried to remove that as much as I can for myself, and I try to think, how can I compete with myself? How can I just be a better version of what I was 5 years ago, musically, mentally, all that stuff? And that's made for better music, more fun, everything feeling more enjoyable and looser and freer, and not being so in my head about it. And that's made all these songs that have come out in the last 2 months, the first two singles, and the songs that are about to come out, some of the most fun I've had and joy in creating, and less about like, is this going to be a hit? Is this going to be successful? At the end of the day, it's like, was it fun, and was it worthwhile to get whatever lyrics, whatever off my chest? That to me is the two most important things in creating now.
Man, amen. I mean, I was about to ask you sort of like broadly, like, what's the point of what you're doing at this point? Like, why are we doing this at all? Sort of what's the sort of cosmic point of it? But I think you sort of answered it without me even
Yeah.
asking, of like, it's really about having fun at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And like it can
Yeah.
have all these other side benefits, and we can get super, lofty about making art and all that. But at the end of the day, man, isn't that really what it is? It's just, it's having fun and figuring out a way to be creative and be able to make a living off it. That's just cool, man. I don't know.
I agree. I mean, yeah, I think also at this point, when you're doing big shows, when you're doing big rooms, whatever, like there's always that point of burnout. And I think that a lot of people have experienced it before at different degrees. I've definitely felt it before. And you want to create the environment for yourself where you don't feel like you're getting close to burning out. And so sometimes,
Oh, I like
like,
that. Yeah.
yeah, it's not like you have to trick yourself, but you have to really, really mold and shape the people around you and the environment you're in to make sure that it still feels fun. That's taken some time. That's taken, assessing your personal friendships, your personal relationships, and the team that's around you, and like really narrowing that into a place where you feel super comfortable and enjoyable at the end of the day. And that takes time. That doesn't happen overnight either. But like, I see being burnt out, and I see being like quitting and all that stuff and tapping out. Like I see that as like, it's not far away. It's like, it's
Yeah.
just on the other side of it. But there are ways to prevent that. There's so many different ways to not, succumb to that. And I think for a lot of people, it's really right around the corner, you know? So
I think
yeah, that's kind of what the last year has been. Yeah. I've seen, I'm sure you've seen it too. It's like, I've seen every version of what could happen play out through different people. You know, I've seen every version of it. So it's like you want to do the best you can to make sure that it plays out the way, whatever way you want it to play out, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, for you, how do you want it to play out? You know, do you have, beyond sort of the tour you're about to go on this fall and the music that's coming out, like, do you have sort of a bigger, either a vision for it as far as like something you're trying to get to, or just sort of, you know, a ways down the line, like the way it lands, that would be cool kind of thing?
Sure. I mean, it's a really good question. I think that I really like where I'm at. I think I'm not even trying to look higher or anything like that. I like where I'm at. I like if it was like this for the next few years, it would be nice. Like if people kept coming to the shows and I get to do shows. It's like, I think maybe a few years ago, I had like some maybe larger aspirations. I don't know, but like, getting to do something like Red Rocks last year, getting to do Coachella this year, like that feels good. I'm not looking at anything more. Like if I can do that a few more times, that'd be great. If not, that's okay. I think that's another product.
Can I interrupt you just one sec? Because I have a question that just occurred to me. Like those shows, you know, doing Red Rocks, doing Coachella. One thing I talk about a lot on this show is the idea that it's hard to enjoy those big accomplishments in the moment because what we do, the mentality is always sort of like, okay, what's next?
Let's
keep moving. Let's keep growing. Blah, blah, blah. How were those events for you? Like, because it's awesome to hear you say that you're happy where you're at and that you know, because that to me means you're sort of living in the moment. You're present, which is something we all should be trying to do. How do you experience those big accomplishments? Were you able to soak it all in while it was happening?
Yeah, I think so. I think so for sure. I think a good sign is that I walked away and I didn't have too many complaints. Like I think sign. Yeah, because like in the past, like I would do something and I'd be like, oh, that could have gone better, or I wish I'd gone this way or that way or whatever. And like I did those things and it felt great. I walked off Red Rocks. I was like, I'm so glad that we got to do this. It was like 3-4 years in the making because of the pandemic. Coachella, same thing. I thought it was like damn near perfect, which is a very, I don't want to say rare, but like if you are, everyone's like their own biggest critic, right? At the end of the day. But I walked off that stage being like, oh, that went exactly kind of how I wanted it to go. Could have been a little bit better, but like if I died tomorrow, it would be fine. Hyperbolic statement, but like I was happy. I was really happy and I soaked it in. And there's just not much more after that. I don't have like, if you want to get super specific, like arenas, I don't know, man. Like I'm not sure if electronic music or EDM is great in those environments. I think the rooms that I'm playing, I'm so excited to do, getting to do something like the Greek in LA or the Mirage in New York. Like I really can't imagine more than that. You know, that's like very appropriate and fulfilling to me at the end of the day, knowing that people want to come out to those rooms. That's great. I think like I like seeing bands. I saw the 1975 at MSG last year and I'm like, that's great that for a band like that kind of popularity can put you into arenas. Sure. But the hyper successful electronic acts who get to those points, like it's not something that I care too much about or have any aspiration to. I have found quite a lot of peace in kind of like what I'm doing right now, you know?
Man, that's awesome to hear. And this, I'll throw out a hot take here as we're sort of getting to the end of this, but you know, you said like maybe arenas aren't the best place to present electronic music. I don't know that any music is best presented in an arena. You know what I mean?
I would agree with that. Yeah. The sound is never great in there.
It's never great. The seats, you know, it's a fun experience in terms of like, I'm with so many people and a big deal is happening. But in terms of art and in terms of like an emotional connection or something or a cool musical experience, it's never that, no matter who you're seeing, you know?
That's true. I've seen Kanye at MSG. I've seen 1975. I saw Tame Impala at Berkeley Center. All phenomenal shows.
Of
All like
course.
very high up on my list. But I've always felt like the sound was never the best, and I felt like, you know, some of the best shows I've seen were at like the Novo, in LA,
Yeah.
or Terminal 5, or Webster Hall. I've seen some great shows at Webster Hall. But yeah, I'm happy. It's just it's something that I try not to think too much about. Again, a product of being 31 and not looking super far into the future. But for me, it's like I'd like to keep writing. I'd like to keep touring for a bit, and I don't want to say too much about the far, far, far future. But I think the pandemic has definitely sort of altered my point of view a little bit in terms of how I view myself and my levels of happiness and all that stuff, and try to be realistic about everything. That's kind of how I try to approach the future.
I mean, throughout all of this, man, this whole conversation, it seems like you have a really good head on your shoulders. I think you've got a great attitude about all of this. The new music is great. It's awesome to see you having all this energy and excitement for all of this. Just quickly, I wanted to go back to the very beginning to sort of talk about like where this all started, because am I right? You grew up in Long Island for most of childhood?
Yeah,
Were you born there or were you born in Bangladesh?
I was born in Bangladesh, but I moved around a lot growing up in America.
Okay, got you. So
Yeah.
what kind of a kid were you, and what kind of an environment were you growing up in? Like, I'm always curious, they say so much of our personal development happens between ages like 1 to 5, the years we can barely remember. Like, what kind of environment were you growing up in that, eventually leads to you being you and us having this conversation?
I was a nerdy kid, man. I was a nerdy kid. I was in like all the AP honors classes, all that stuff. I was like a math and science kid. I'm the child of 2 physicists. My dad has a PhD in physics. Yeah, come from a smart family.
Oh,
and
yeah.
even
So then
beyond,
being a DJ is even worse.
well, they're so great about it now. But the funny thing is that my culture is still a very like arts oriented culture. So growing up, I played the violin, and my musical side was quite nourished. I was encouraged to pursue the violin and be good at it in school. As a career, not so much. Like, there was definitely some hesitation. It wasn't like a strict, like, you can't do music, but, as I was doing all this honors stuff with math and science and whatnot, I was also able to be in like honors orchestra as well and do that. So I think the music stuff obviously carries. What happened to me though is something that I've seen talked about on TikTok a lot, as it's kind of like a meme. They call it gifted kid burnout, where being in something like the gifted program, or being told you're special growing up in terms of education, it really messes with your head. Because I think for a long time, like, I was ahead in all my classes because my mom would be teaching me all this extra stuff, and everything would come quote unquote naturally for me. I'd be acing all the exams. There is a certain point where that doesn't work. That's high school. Because when I got to high school and I was getting like a D in math, and like pre-calculus, and calculus wasn't making sense to me, and I wasn't doing well in AP bio, it's because I had to actually work to get those scores, and it wasn't no longer coming naturally to me. That's when I found a lot of struggle in my life. And a lot of that struggle was happening between 2009 to 2019, probably, because like, I had to work for it. And this kind of, tie it to the start of the conversation, something I had to kind of teach myself again in my 20s, where I had to like really learn how to stay on top of my shit, because it was something that I didn't really have growing up. I had that, whatever that natural thing was, just disappeared. That's something I would never do with my kids in the future. I would never tell them that you're special, you're really good at math or whatever, but I also I wouldn't bully them either. I just think
of course,
that you don't want to inflate a child's sense of how intelligent they are, it's only going to get to their heads. It's only going to affect their work ethic in the future. Because I thought I was, quote unquote, I thought I was so smart. I thought I was smarter than everyone else, and I didn't have to work for it. It's a horrible, horrible, terrible ideology and mentality to have, and it carries with you too. I like to be candid again. There were times in the mid 2010s where that bled into DJing and being in the scene and everything. I think that's something that happens to a lot of kids, where ego will sort of consume you, and it takes a lot of time to uncouple from that and uncouple from those feelings where you think you're hot shit. I've met so many kids like this, myself included, and like that pans out in so many different ways too, where like you'll face some hard reality check where it's like, oh, you're not hot shit.
Yeah,
but
and especially you know, when having those moments when something goes well early on, like for you, maybe Indian Summer, and for a million other people, there's a ton of examples of that. And I think about that all the time, because you can see sometimes when somebody gets that first success, and maybe if they do have a big head, or if they do feel entitled in some way. I'm not saying this was you, but you can see it sort of go off the rails, because all of a sudden they're like, I was right. You know, they're like, I am great.
I've seen it.
And dude, and it either they eventually come back down and continue on and sort of figure out life. But I've seen it go the other way too, where they just sort of fly away and it never goes good.
So many different ways that can pan out. And for me, I think a large part of it was I would always come back to New York. I was living with my parents for a very long time. Even up until 2019, I was living with my parents until I was like 27. And I think coming home, I'm still friends with my high school friends, my home friends. Like a lot of that stuff definitely brought me back. Took some years, but like it's a journey at the end of the day, you know. But who I was, to answer your question of who I was, like I was just a dorky kid back then. I still think that a lot of that still carries into who I am today, for sure.
That's probably good, man.
I straight up have like Spider-Man Legos and shit like that here.
Oh, so. Nice. Are you a Lego guy? You do the big sets?
Oh man, I have big sets sitting at my apartment in New York that still need to be built, but the minifigures bring me so much joy, man. I got this Groot one the other day, and like I don't know, man. I like it. Just that's the type of shit that, like, all right, now that I like, it's not fancy cars or anything for me. It's like it's like Legos. Oh, dude, you know?
Yeah. I do a lot of like D&D stuff, so I've got tons of like little miniatures and all that, man. So I'm right there with you. That's like sometimes the simplest little things keep you. I mean, it's just fun and I like doing it, but I think it does keep you connected to sort of those roots and just the fact that all of this is silly and all of this should be fun, you know?
Yeah. Little studio pals, you know?
Yeah, exactly, man. Well, I'll wrap this up in a second, but just talking about like growing up and staying with your parents and all that, this is an ignorant question on my part because I haven't spent a ton of time in Long Island, but my impression, or maybe my stereotype of Long Island, is like, you know, it's right next to New York City, which is like such a hub of culture and art and everything, and a mixing pot of so many different peoples and cultures and blah, blah, blah. And my impression of Long Island is that it's sort of not any of that, and that it's like fairly homogenous and maybe a little less of like so many different peoples and cultures. Am I right about that? Like, what did it feel like to you growing up?
You're half right. You're half right in that it's not a place of quote unquote the arts, perhaps, but it is actually quite diverse where I was at. I lived in Nassau County in Long Island. There's quite a lot of South Asian, East Asian people all across. In the district school I went to was 50% Asian. It's a lot of melting pot. Homogenous is how I describe where I used to live, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I was the only South Asian kid. Yeah. But Long Island, I thought it was great being around so many different people. I felt like there wasn't like racial tension. Whereas like in Pittsburgh post 9/11, there was definitely some middle school wasn't the most fun time for me when I was living there. But in
Oh
high school it was
man.
great because like everyone just sort of got along, and like New York's great like that. I really enjoyed like being there for sure because it just felt like everyone got along really nicely.
That's interesting to hear that about Pittsburgh too, man. Because yeah, post 9/11, the ignorance and the craziness that happened post 9/11, that must have been
Yeah.
wild.
No, that was 2002 to 2005. Like I know Pittsburgh specifically now is quite a blue city, and it's still pretty diverse. I think just the district I was in was like
Yeah.
very homogenous. But
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's not about Pittsburgh specifically, but just sort of that experience of
the environment.
Yeah. I mean, did you? Okay, I promise this is me wrapping it up, but
I don't mind. I don't mind.
Okay, great. I just never want to keep people longer than they want to talk. But let me ask you this: we sort of started off this whole conversation talking about Indian Summer and the origins like of this project, and now talking about like your cultural experiences living in different places in the US, and either feeling othered or feeling part of a community, that sort of thing. Like it makes me wonder, a song like Indian Summer, which is your breakout song, obviously has lots of South Asian influence in it, right? Like the main line, the instrumentation, the melody, the whole thing. Did that song blowing up unexpectedly? It's interesting in a cultural perspective too, because God, yeah, now that I'm saying it, it's a couple different angles. Because I think there's, for you, then do you suddenly feel like, oh, I have to be a representative of this culture? And is this, the only way I can express myself now that people associate me with this sound, that kind of thing? But then secondly, there's so much sort of shitty like use of ethnic, quote unquote, instrumentation in dance music by, honestly, mostly white people who don't have a context and use it in sort of basic, corny ways. I should stop talking and just ask you, like, was any of that in your head? Did you have an experience culturally of like putting out a song like that, it blowing up unexpectedly, and then you sort of having to figure it out?
Let me just start by saying that I don't mind talking. I have nothing to do after this. So
okay, awesome.
the answer I'm going to give you, there's a lot of layers, a lot of nuance, and it's very funny that you're asking this at the end, like towards the end or whatever. But I'm happy to chat about this because it's a
weird way to wrap it up, but yeah.
No, it's fine. It's fine. There's a lot of layers and a lot of context. I want to just make sure that I can express it properly and as well as I can. I made that song because my friend Nabil, shout out to Nabil, that for a long time was telling me like, hey, you should like, it'd be so cool if you like did a song where you like sampled something Indian or Bangladeshi or whatever. So I kind of went into that doing that in mind because he told me to do that. I never wanted to make a career out of doing specifically that. Not that I grew up with Indian classical music. I grew up with Bengali classical music. I used to play violin at my temple and all that stuff. I was very culturally tapped in growing up. But that's not how I wanted to express myself as Jai Wolf. That was never like the original intention or anything like that. That was like a fluke. So when that song blew up, there was definitely a lot of expectation that I would make more music like that. I think the people that were trying to sign me and my community and all that stuff, there was like, you have like a South Asian electronic artist, blah, blah, blah. You was influenced by that. That's not what I ever wanted to do. And that's why a lot of the stuff after I never really made another Indian Summer after that. And thankfully, I want to say that a lot of my fans were super understanding. They were super on board with what I was doing. And I'm really grateful for that. There's a bit more nuance with the South Asian stuff because it can go so many different ways. And this is not just with white people. There are even South Asian people who sample their own culture in like corny, cliched ways. There's a right way to do it, and then there's like a corny way to do it. I think artists like Memba are phenomenal. They're so good at what they do. They do the South Asian thing so much better than I do. Memba is a duo from New York. It's Ishan and Will. They're incredible trap producers, engineers. They're some of the most nicest, talented people I know. They do the thing where they sample ethnic, if you want to call it, whatever, South Asian stuff, Middle Eastern stuff. Like, it sounds really good and it's well done. So when people are like, oh, like, I'm looking for stuff like Indian Summer, I'm always like, check out Memba or even Troy Boy. Troy Boy does a really good job of that as well. There's a lot of great stuff out there for sure. That was just never my personal intention. I think being South Asian and being expected to do that, however, this is a larger context that's more a discussion that happens a lot in the South Asian community with music, where a lot of us feel like there is that expectation where we have to box ourselves in a little bit. And it almost is a little brain breaking when people see South Asian people do things that are not South Asian oriented. Like if there was a South Asian rock star or South Asian rapper and they're not using traditional South Asian instruments, that's something that's sort of, I don't want to call it a struggle, but a subject of discourse in the South Asian community that extends beyond dance music. This is like a general conversation that perhaps maybe a lot of the mainstream is unaware of. That's like a whole separate conversation. And like I said, there's a lot of layers and nuance to it. But for me, for a really long time, my whole thing has been like, I want to see more South Asian people become successful without having to feel like they have to box themselves into the, like, using South Asian tropes in their sound palette. I talked to Asim about this in Hotel Garuda about how, like, with like house music and him not like tapping into throwing in a tabla or whatever into the music that he's making, you know? And I want to see more successful South Asian artists do that without having to like exist in the confines of cultural and societal expectations of like, you need to link your heritage with what you're doing, which becomes like a very tired conversation at times. And every time AAPI month rolls around, I'm getting interviews about it. And, you know, the first proper AAPI month was like 2017, and it was exciting. It was like, cool. I get to like talk a little bit more about that. And I'm happy to talk about my upbringing and who I am as a person. But it's so funny when I still get to this day, like, does being South Asian affect the music you're making? And I'm like, you could just listen to my discography and figure that out yourself, you know? But I like the more nuanced question of like, what were the expectations after Indian Summer? What were the results of that? How did you feel? Like that? That's like fine to talk about, of course. I think sometimes when interviewers ask, in 2023, are you influenced by your South Asian heritage? It's like, you don't know any of my songs other than Indian Summer.
Well, of course. Well, and it's such a weird question because what would that even mean? It's like, obviously you're influenced by it, but I think what that question really ends up being a lot of the time is an oversimplification that maybe the person asking the question just hasn't really thought through what that actually means, right? Because if the only way you can represent your heritage is by sort of presenting what has come before in a way that everybody recognizes, you know, not that there's anything wrong with doing that, but that's not the only way you can represent heritage. It's not the only way,
right? And I'm glad you say that, because I've talked to people about this. I've talked to other South Asian people about this. To me, it's like, my existence is enough. I think me existing and presenting myself the way I'm presenting myself does not make me any less South Asian, of course. I don't need to prove it in my music. I don't need to prove it in a melody or a sound palette. I think just by showing up, by default, everything I do is inherently South Asian, because that's who I am as a person. And that's kind of how I look at it, where it's like, when, you know, I know like, quote unquote, identity politics is a interesting subject, and everyone will have a different opinion on it. And the way I see it is that there's kind of like two ends of the spectrum. One is like, you push yourself super heavily and lead with identity first and not the music, which I think is not the right way to go about marketing yourself. I think that's an issue where it's like, I am a South Asian artist, this is why you should listen to me, instead of like, this is the music and story I'm trying to tell. But then the other end of it is being completely devoid of any sort of cultural or people don't know that you're South Asian, which actually was happening to me for a few years. There's quite a few years where a lot of people didn't realize that I was South Asian. I was like, man, I gotta just post more pictures of myself or something.
Right.
Like that got to me as an issue. Or like when it doesn't come up, when it's devoid of that. That's the two ends of the spectrum, where you're extremely leaning on your identity or it's devoid. For me, it's like I want to be somewhere in the middle, where it's like I don't want to lead with it, but I also think that my existence is still important to my story. I think knowing about how I grew up, where I was born, who my parents were, are still domino effects to where I am today. That's part of the story and part of like who I am as a person. Of course, that's very important. But to me, it's like you want to be in the middle of that spectrum. You don't want to be too far on one end or too far on the other, you know?
Even that, like, I think it's shitty to even try to say that there is a right way to do it. You know what I mean? Like, I think even saying that, like, yeah, someone's not doing it enough or someone's doing it too much, it's reductive of the whole conversation. And it's sort of I feel like a lot of people saying that, well, I mean, anyone white who's saying that is saying that from a crazy position, because those questions, white artists never even have to think about those questions.
They don't even have to. They don't have to ever think about that. It's a whole other. That's a whole other thing. But I have a lot of respect for anyone. I have a lot of respect for anyone who does tap into their personal heritage through sound or whatever. I still think that that's like cool and whatnot. It's not necessarily the path that I'm on. But for me, it's more like, you know, do your research before assuming. I felt like that before, where it's like the narrative is sort of being created for you. And a lot of that was happening around Indian Summer too, where it was like, well, that's not really me. That's just not who I am as a person. Like I have always told people that the song that felt the most me that I've ever made is a song like Starlight. Like that feels like that's my soul as a song. That song feels closer to me. A song like Moonrider feels closer to me. And the songs that are about to be put out feel the most me that they've ever felt. Indian Summer was just like a little experiment, but an experiment that took a life of its own, you know. But that song is now more enjoyed and consumed and interpreted. Like that's like the fan song, which I think is great. It's like it's used in so many different ways. It's used. People are walking down the aisle to it. People use it to do yoga and cycling, and they use it for their travel vlogs. Blah blah blah. That's like that's now less my soul and more like the people's soul, which I think is great in its own way. You know.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of it too, right? It's like we can't control how what we make is going to be interpreted. So,
yes,
you know, you just make something that feels right to you, and what happens afterwards, it's kind of out of our hands, you know?
Yeah.
Well, dude, I really like talking to you, man. This is super fun. Is there anything else we should say about what you're doing right now, as far as like the tour? Actually, I wanted to ask you, I don't usually ask you like where did names and titles come from, but what's the meaning behind Blue Babu for the tour name?
Yeah, so the tour name is something that, you know, the name of the era is something that I came up with a couple years ago, and Babu is what my parents call me. It means child. It's like a term of endearment. You know, relating back to what we've been talking about this whole time, I think that the songs that I've been writing feel like a very true self. I'm finding a lot of joy in writing them, and a lot of that harkens back to my childhood and kind of that freedom that I felt back then. But there's also a lot of you know in the lyrics and stuff, and for a lot of the songs that are going to come out, like a lot of self-reflection, a lot of some sadness, and some existentialism and stuff like that. A lot of different topics that are explored. I'm sitting in every writer's room when we write these songs together. That's been super important to me, where it's not just like top line sent to me. And so I thought Blue Babu was sort of a really good way to encompass the entire era and all the songs that we're putting out. And feels, I know this is like a cliched statement, but it's like the realest me in my realest state, you know. But I know
Yeah.
every artist says that, but I think the word and the phrase is like a very, very accurate statement and very personal. And I know everyone says it's my most personal work yet. But like, I also am a big fan of like unique titling, where it's like if you search for something, you're not going to find anything, any combination of those words or whatnot. So I thought Blue Babu just felt like no one has put those two words together. So I think
Yeah,
that to me
no,
is
it's
like really,
catchy.
really,
That's honestly, it's part of why I asked you about it, because it's an interest,
yeah,
like it's fun to say and it sounds interesting. Like there's something,
yeah,
even that kind of thing, man, to get sort of nerdy about it. Like there's something to the art of just putting a couple words together that sound good together. That even something like that is
yeah.
part of like what is fun about art. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. That to me was super important and really defining the last few years for me. And yeah, I mean, you know, just to wrap everything up, I'm just excited. I'm so excited about everything that's coming. I think like, you know, we kicked off at Coachella. We're putting out these songs. We have 3 more songs coming out this summer, and if all things go well, I think a song a month until the end of the year. We're really trying to flip the narrative of scarcity to tie it back to the beginning.
Yep. I love
And
it.
just have fun with it. I want to treat the fans. I want to make sure that they're getting the music in real time and engaging with it. And the show is just going to be so much fun. I think like we're in a really good place in terms of like building a really fun and unique experience. I think the show that we put on at Coachella was like, it was just great. I was just so proud of that. I'm proud of my whole team. I'm proud of everyone who was involved with bringing that to life. I'm working with some of my favorite people. They're not just like strangers or people that like I've been put in touch with, but like everyone from my sound guy Sean to my lighting guy Devin, to my managers Ben and Dash. Like just everyone is so great to work with, and that's made me feel very excited to embark on this tour. It's the longest tour I've done. I told my agent to put all the dates together and just
Yeah.
like let's just knock it out so we could do festivals next year. So it's like 10 weeks, and I haven't done a headline tour since 2019, but it feels good. All the preparation is there. We've talked about it, and like just feels like it's I'm in a healthy place to do something like that. And I'm thankful for anyone who's been on the ride, who's coming to the show, supporting all that stuff. Like just feels good, you know. And I'm glad that I get to talk to you about this, and to I haven't really. This might be the first interview for the era, to be honest.
Oh, that's great,
So
man.
yeah, I'm hoping. I'm excited for people to see this because it will be some of the first looks behind my process and in my mind of where I've been the last few years. So
Hey man, well, it's exciting. I think your energy for it is infectious, man. I feel great talking to you. I hope you feel good. And the last thing I wanted to say, you know, you were talking about how this is sort of like the most real you, or like the whatever you want to say, my most personal work, and how that's sort of an awkward or corny thing to say. What it made me think of, and I just wanted to say this to you, is that to me it's sort of like, rather than like the most real or the most personal, I think of this kind of stuff as almost like a camera focusing, like a lens, because everything you've
mhm.
put out is the real you, right? Like it's all you. But I
Yeah,
sort of think about like maybe a song like Indian Summer is like someone taking a picture of you from like an angle and they catch one side. And then another song is a more complete one, but maybe it's a little out of focus. And
mhm.
over time, I think what you're talking about really is just getting it into focus. Now, maybe it's a little more high def. Maybe you're getting a wider picture. And that's what I'm hearing, man. So I don't think you got to feel awkward saying that at all.
Yeah. That's a really good analogy, by the way.
Thanks,
Yeah.
man. But I think it's true, man. And I'm stoked to hear the new music. And yeah, anything else you need to get out there? Or should we wrap it up?
I think that's it. I'm just excited to do what I love to do at the end of the day.
Beautiful, man. Well, that's a great note to end it on, man. Thank you for doing this, dude. I appreciate your time. This was great.
Yeah, appreciate you having me.
All right, man. Have a good rest of your day. I'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon, man. Peace.
All right, peace.